In 1974, a small group of radical Tory MPs, led by Keith Joseph and Margaret Thatcher, decided that Britain was heading for economic ruin and that radical new thinking was needed. And this is where it came from. The Institute of Economic Affairs was established by two working-class radicals, Ralph Harris and Arthur Selden.
And one of Margaret Thatcher speaking to Ralph Harris. And that's Arthur Selden there.
I mean, looking at that, hardly members of the establishment.
Not exactly members of the establishment. This is a few people from basically pretty humble backgrounds.
The founders of the IEA were joined by other working-class political activists. Alfred Sherman, a working-class Jew and former communist from London's East End, who became Margaret Thatcher's political mentor and speechwriter, and Madison Peary and Eamon Butler, who would help mastermind Mrs. Thatcher's privatisation programme.
It was a notable fact about the free enterprise movement of the 1970s that most of its participants were not from the traditional Tory class at all.
They're working class men, and men inspired by ideas, not obviously naturally within the reach of conservatism or the Conservative Party. Radicals, actually.
Mrs. Thatcher and the founders of the IEA were inspired by the writings of an Austrian former socialist, Friedrich Hayek. Hayek had turned against his old socialist beliefs because, he said, although socialism promised to liberate and enrich the workers, it had in fact done the exact opposite.
In Hayek, you actually have a former socialist who actually starts warning about socialism and sees freedom as the answer. Not conservatism, freedom. Free markets were helping the working classes, not oppressing them. That was the centrepiece of the new ideas that were actually going to then go on and guide the Thatcher administration.
There began moves among these free market radicals to stage a coup, to displace Ted Heath as leader of the Conservative Party, which was at that time in opposition.
There was a feeling amongst those of us committed to the free market persuasion that we were a revolutionary cell. There were not many of us, and we would ask of people, are they one of us?
In 1975, it was decided that Margaret Thatcher would stand for the leadership. The existing Tory leader, Ted Heath, had the support of the upper-class grandees. But Mrs. Thatcher appealed to the middle-class, rank-and-file Tory members. In her memoirs, she described her election as a shattering blow to the Conservative establishment.
A few paces from the front door, she met the first microphones and gave her initial reaction of becoming the first woman to achieve the leadership breakthrough in British politics.
Inside the old-fashioned Tory party was let loose a female termagant, they would say, who was conducting a guerrilla war against their best beliefs.
A woman leader was revolutionary. A woman leader with Margaret Thatcher's background was unheard of, and she led what I once called a peasant's revolt.
Margaret would never have been picked by the magic circle. There were people who should be ruling, and there were people who should be being ruled. And Margaret, I'm afraid, was in the second category, not the first.
The old Tory hierarchy may have been dismayed at the election of Mrs. Thatcher, but the Labour leadership was delighted.
Callaghan said, after her election, we've just won the next election. He just didn't believe that the Conservative Party, led by a woman, could beat him.
In the 1979 election, once again, Mrs. Thatcher directed her campaign not at traditional Tory voters, but at the working class.
The Conservative policy and Conservative Party consists of people who come from all walks of life, and the policy is for people in all walks of life.
I'm sure it's right that Margaret and I were much closer to the average person in the street than our predecessors, either in the leadership of the Labour Party or the Conservative Party.
What Margaret Thatcher did with the Conservative Party was to move her tanks right on to the Labour Party's lawn.
The result was the biggest electoral reversal since the war.
A huge crowd and a huge cheer.
The swing to the Conservatives was made up overwhelmingly of working-class voters. An incredible 10% of Labour's working-class vote switched to Tory.
Well, Mrs. Thatcher's now gone over to greet the crowds, shaking every hand that she can possibly get hold of. This is now the great photo call.
She was Britain's first woman Prime Minister, but anyone who thought she would be a soft touch was about to get a nasty surprise.
She was a leader. She would make up her mind. She would be determined and deliberate that you would always know where you were with Margaret Thatcher, and even when you disagreed with her, this was the order of the day.
It's quite some time since you banged the table. Is that what you're saying you will do this time if things don't...
I would have to bang the table, but I don't want to have to bang the table, and because I've banged it before and they know I will bang it again, there's less likelihood that I'll have to bang it.
I don't give a damn what people say. We're not doing that.
No, never.
Margaret was very blunt. You always knew exactly what she thought, and she was straight with the British people.
I like to be straight, I like to be clear, I like to be honest.
Well, that's why she was so popular.
Her supporters admired her steely resolve. Her enemies feared it.
By the end of next month...
Mrs. Thatcher was determined to dismantle state control. Many in the loss-making nationalised industries would lose their jobs. Some industries, like shipbuilding, would shrink to a fraction of their former size.
The devastation that happened to those communities under Margaret Thatcher was remarkable, because within a very, very short period of time, something happened that had never been done to very large communities before. Mining, steel, and shipbuilding were devastated overnight, with no chance for any alternative to be introduced, no chance for retraining, no chance for shifting those communities towards something else.
Because of what Mrs. Thatcher and her policies and the people who deferred to her did to lots of people in this country who weren't really in a position to defend themselves, I have great difficulty in finding respect for her or for them.
To the Labour left, cutting subsidies to loss-making state industry was unforgivable. To Mrs. Thatcher, it was the first step to recovery.
It was failing. She actually had the honesty and the courage to say, this isn't a proper industry. This is make-believe industry. We're subsidising this. We're making it up.
She knew in her mind what had to be done. She knew it was going to be tough, particularly at the beginning in 1979.
I think when she took over in 1979, I think people were beginning to think that perhaps Britain was in an irreversible decline, an economic decline, and she turned that round. She was immensely courageous.
What she said was, actually, this is going to be good for the country. You're going to take the medicine.
And the fact that on the way, people are going to revile you, that doesn't matter at all.
Mrs. Thatcher's battle with the left over state control was in essence a battle between two different visions of the working class. According to the socialists, the working class was oppressed, and the source of that oppression was economic freedom. Their idea of progress was to have the working class living in state housing, travelling on state transport, working for state-controlled industries. Socialists fought not to change, but to preserve traditional jobs and working practices, and working-class communities, as they were called. And in post-war Britain, until Mrs. Thatcher came along, they got their way.
It was so awful. You weren't going anywhere. Your parents lived in a council flat, you were living in a council flat. You had a crappy job, your parents had a crappy job, you were going to have a crappy job. Your parents had a crappy car, you're going to have a crappy car. Your kids, don't worry about that, they're going down the same road. We were basically North Korea, but without the hope.
If you want to be cruel about the left-wing worldview, it is in essence that of looking after the lower orders, and I picked that phrase carefully, the lower orders sufficiently well that they're going to be satisfied with their lot.
They live in their council blocks, they have fairly low-paid jobs, they'll never do much better, they're just struggling to survive and perhaps need to be looked after a little bit, but their prospects are really pretty grim.
The socialist vision of the working class offended Mrs. Thatcher to the core.
They think it's attractive to offer to the young a future wholly controlled by the operation of the socialist state. What is their message? To each his own pigeonhole, from each total conformity. We utterly reject it.
Charlie Mullins was one of the working-class voters who switched from Labour to Tory when Mrs Thatcher became leader.
This is where I unfortunately was brought up. I mean, that's shit old air. Absolute carsy. My mother was a barmaid and my father works in a factory, you know, so very much Labour people, but I voted for Tories because, you know, this ain't what I wanted for the rest of my life.
But the Thatcher-supporting working-class Tory was an object of scorn for many on the left.
Huge numbers of working-class people clearly liked Margaret Thatcher. How do you explain that?
Yeah. In the makeup of the British working-class Conservative, there is an element of deference, of order-taking, especially if they can be convinced that there are others below them that are suitably deferential to them.
There was such a large slice of people who were aspirational, who wanted to distinguish themselves from people who were perhaps a little lower than them in the pecking order. They were the charge hands, the people who were junior management, if you like. They were the non-commissioned officers of the working classes on their way upwards.
But to Mrs Thatcher's supporters, there wasn't anything wrong with wanting to get on.
There can't be anybody who doesn't believe that, you know, we wouldn't mind a rather nicer car, a slightly bigger house, or a house at all. Or even if we didn't have the house. Have you seen my Tom's doing rather well? He's just bought a semi out in out Basildon way, you know.
In Mrs Thatcher's first Queen's speech, she announced that people in state housing would be allowed to buy their own homes. The Town and Country Planning Act of 1947 had imposed strict limits on private house building. Instead, the state would build them. Ordinary people who wanted a home had to apply to the authorities, who would then allocate them a house or a flat.
When this new block of flats in Plymouth has been completed, it will house 116 dwellers.
By the 1970s, a third of Britain's population lived in state housing.
At the end of their lives, they had nothing. They passed on nothing to their children. They had nothing to call their own except maybe a television and some furniture, and that would be about it. And what she did was say to them all of a sudden, you can own the most important thing in your life, your home.
Why do you need to own your own house? The house prices weren't going anywhere. You weren't going to make a big fortune. You know, why did it matter? But actually, it did seem to matter. So deep down inside people, they wanted something more than the state handing them stuff.
Rows of seemingly identical houses, but amongst them the badges of Thatcherism. New front doors in place of the old standard issue and replacement double-glazed windows.
For the first time, capital and passing it on to your children isn't something that a tiny minority of the rich can do. It's something that millions and millions of people who never thought they'd have any capital can do.
Some of the Labour councillors who'd been leading the campaign against us, saying this was outrageous and morally wrong, started buying their own council houses because they were council tenants. And when that happened, I said, we've won.
The Hunts are one of almost 1 million couples who've bought their council house since Mrs Thatcher became Prime Minister. At the last election, like their parents before them, they voted Labour. But this time, they'll be voting Conservative.
Mrs Thatcher's policy of selling council houses proved incredibly popular. The Labour Party decided to change its policy.
I changed the policy in the Labour Party. Didn't have much to do with Margaret Thatcher. It had everything to do with Gordon and Mary Kinnock, my parents. I just thought it would have been a compliment to them and a reward for their labours had they been able to buy that council house.
Mrs Thatcher's policies didn't just prove popular with the electorate. At her election, The Sun, which had previously been a staunch Labour newspaper, switched to Tory. When Kelvin Mackenzie became editor in 1981, it became solidly Thatcherite.
In a sense, when you edit a newspaper, you have to be on your reader's side. And you would have thought, well, if you're going to start rubber stamping Conservative policies against the interests of the working man and woman of this country, what's going to happen? You're going to go down like that, and the Daily Mirror, the voice allegedly of the ordinary working stiff in the streets, right, is going to go through the roof. In that period of time, our sale continued to climb and the mirrors continued to fall. The greatest single moment of my life, every single day, was when I pass a white van and there, on the shelf in front of their wheel, there was a copy of The Sun. And that was without fear or favour, it was always there.
What really annoys people on the left isn't that Margaret Thatcher was a conservative. In many ways she wasn't. It wasn't that Margaret Thatcher was working for the bosses. She wasn't. What annoys them is she started converting who they thought were their own people.
In the early 80s, although Mrs. Thatcher was winning support from the new working class Tories, her free market radicalism brought her into direct conflict with the upper class Tory establishment, the so-called Wets, who still dominated the party.
Thatcher's internal struggle within the Conservative Party was epic.
The division in the Conservative Party did, as a lot of people have suggested, roughly follow class lines.
She wasn't impressed simply because someone had an estate or a castle or a title. She would be suspicious of them and think they were probably just against change.
She inherited a party and above all a shadow cabinet which was rooted in the old ways, the earlier ways, the consensus politics of post-war Britain. And she was definitely uncomfortable. She was in a minority in her own cabinet, there's no doubt about that.
If you were to look at the cabinet that she took over, I reckon perhaps 2 of them had voted for her.
She had to work initially towards bypassing them and then finally beginning to get rid of those who were instinctively, naturally and culturally opposed to her thinking.
In 81, she struck against the grandees. In a dramatic cabinet reshuffle, she brought in key Thatcherites like Norman Tebbit and Cecil Parkinson, and she sacked leading Wets like Christopher Soames.
What kind of news are you expecting this morning, sir? Morning.
The old Tory grandees were horrified.
They just felt it was their duty and that their background qualified them to be in charge.
There's a rather interesting passage in her memoirs where she describes getting rid of Christopher Soames and says he clearly regarded it as being dismissed by his own parlourmaid. That gives you a sort of feel for some of the relationships at that time.
They just didn't think it was right that a grammar school girl from Grantham should be telling them they were no longer in the cabinet.
The old guard of the Conservative Party found some of the things she did quite distasteful. And they didn't like all these new sort of garages coming in, as they were called, the lower orders.
People like Cecil Parkinson, who was the son of a railway engine driver, and myself, who was the son of a house painter and retail salesman. This was just not quite what had been expected of the world.
Norman, send in the Chancellor, will you?
Yes, leader.
Norman Tebbit was mocked by upper-class Tories for his Cockney accent. In the media, he was depicted as a working-class bruiser. To Mrs. Thatcher, he was just the man she needed to take on the unions.
Well, I had a very unusual background in many ways for an up-and-coming Conservative. I had been a trades unionist, a shop steward. I'd helped to organise a strike. I'd been on strike.
The unions were fierce opponents of privatisation. Concentrating industries into state monopolies had given union leaders enormous power, and they were reluctant to lose it.
Massively powerful trade unions who basically had the country by the cojones, and every time they wanted something, squeezed.
When it was nationalised, if they could just call a strike and they knew that they'd have the country to ransom, because if they didn't get what they wanted, everything was shut down.
And so the union leadership could call a strike without balloting its members.
Yes.
You had to be a member of the trade union to work there.
Yeah, you did.
You had to go on strike.
You had to be a member of the trade union, otherwise you couldn't work there. And that's what happened.
That was what was killing British industry.
Of course it was.
From midnight last night, rail services used by more than 2 million people were shut down.
Mrs. Thatcher believed that union militancy, far from helping workers, was wrecking British industry. There was a great gulf, Mrs. Thatcher believed, between the interests and views of union leaders and the people they claimed to represent, and she knew whose side she was on.
It was the guys on the shop floor who were okay. It was the trade union leaders who were the problem.
The solution, said Mrs. Thatcher, was to give more power to ordinary workers and union members.
She didn't try to break the unions, she tried to make them more democratic.
Mrs. Thatcher gave union members the right to elect their leaders, to be consulted in a secret ballot on whether or not to strike, and to leave the union if they wished, without losing their job.
And there's no other way we could...
The new democracy didn't go down well with union leaders, but it won Mrs. Thatcher huge popular support, which was further strengthened by her victory in the Falklands War. Despite the pain of economic reform, Mrs. Thatcher's election victory in 1983 was the most decisive since the Second World War.
For Mrs. Thatcher, triumph was sweet, and she chose to share it with some of the people who'd given her a landslide victory.
A larger victory than I had ever dared to hope.
The Labour vote fell again, this time by 3 million. Labour's share of the working class vote dropped even further. It was the worst result for Labour since 1900, when the party was founded. Even among trade unionists, almost as many were now voting Tory as were voting Labour.
We have been treated with contempt.
Incensed by trade union reform and the threatened closure of loss-making pits, Arthur Scargill, the militant mine union leader, decided to take action. He tried and failed 3 times to win a strike ballot. In the end, he called a strike without one, and he organised a small army of flying pickets in an effort to cut the supply of coal to the power plants.
By this stage, missiles, including pieces of fencing, were being thrown at the police.
Our duty demands and the national interest requires that we see that violence does not pay and is seen not to pay.
The pickets knew what to expect. They'd been warned it could turn nasty, and it did.
It was a trial of strength between Mrs. Thatcher and Arthur Scargill.
Get in here to see what they're doing.
Scargill ended up in hospital.
Police said he'd fallen and hurt himself. Mr. Scargill had a different version.
All I know is that these bastards rushed in and this guy hit me up back at head with a bloody shield and knocked me to the ground out.
If we'd lost the miners' strike, we would have been destined to be run by the trade union movement forever. Today, trade union movement, what is it?
With the threat of union action gone, Mrs. Thatcher pressed ahead with privatisation. Moving state industries into the private sector, she believed, would not just revive their fortunes, it would also spread wealth and ownership like never before.
The idea was a nation of owners, every man and every woman an owner, as part of the journey that we were going on, because we felt it was quite wrong that wealth should be concentrated in a limited number of hands.
Every man and woman a capitalist, she used to shout at me. Hey, that's what I want, every man and woman a capitalist.
The Tory upper-class grandees publicly condemned privatisation. Harold Macmillan, the former Tory Prime Minister, said it was like an impoverished aristocratic family selling off the valuables.
First the Georgian silver goes. Then all that nice furniture that used to be in the saloon. And then the Canalettos go.
The forces of reaction, or the establishment, were shocked by what we were suggesting.
I was told time and time again, often by Tories, no one will want to buy the shares, and you'll have riots, the workers won't accept it, and the standards will fall away.
Those who thought this share offer would not hold much attraction for the small investor were proved wrong this morning. Applications were arriving even before it got light.
All our push in our policies was to spread ownership.
Telecom's aim has been to get as many individuals as possible to buy shares. The stock exchange has never experienced anything like it.
And it was done in a most dramatic fashion.
Telecom says there's every sign that it'll be deluged with applications from ordinary members of the public for the shares.
Good afternoon, British Telecom Share Information Service.
The response has been so great it's hired extra staff.
Smaller investors were given preferential treatment, while workers were encouraged to buy shares in their own industries.
The trade union bosses told their members that on no account must they subscribe for shares, and the members ignored them completely.
When British Steel was privatised, 94% of workers bought shares. When National Power was privatised, 99% of workers bought shares. Privatisations of British Telecom and gas were massively oversubscribed.
The forms are coming in so fast, we literally can't count them.
99% of people on the steelworks where I worked, they all bought shares. And it was a fantastic opportunity.
We increased the number of individual shareholders to 9 million.
If you had predicted in the 1960s that in just a decade or two's time, share ownership will be more common than trade union membership, you would have been laughed at. But actually, that's what happens.
As Mrs. Thatcher predicted, privatisation didn't just change ownership, it changed attitudes.
Everybody was encouraged to work hard to get the bonuses. It was
so you were sharing in profits.
Sharing in profits.
Part owner of the company.
That's right.
And it alters your perspective on
it. It does. It was fantastic. It was.
For the newly privatised state industries, there would be no more government bailouts. They made a profit or they died. The transformation was breathtaking. Almost overnight, the long waiting lists for telephones and gas cookers disappeared. Former state organisations, which had been dismissive and rude to their customers, now had to fight for their business.
So if you look at the productivity gains when you actually move something from the public sector to the private sector, in almost all cases, it looks like magic.
Not all the formerly nationalised industries fared well. Some, like coal and shipbuilding, had become so uncompetitive and dependent on government handouts, they struggled to survive. But freed from the burden of supporting loss-making industries, the rest of the economy took off. When Mrs. Thatcher came to power, productivity growth in Britain was among the lowest in the industrial world. Within a few years, it was one of the highest.
Britain was known for suffering from the British disease. Now we're known for having the British cure.
What is surprising looking back is how quickly the Thatcher Revolution transformed Britain. From being the sick man of Europe, you know, the once proud but now ailing giant which had no future, it only took something like 4 or 5 years to turn that around completely.
The message may not have reached the Labour Party, but it certainly reached our friends and competitors abroad. Despite the world recession, despite those long years under Labour, Britain is back in business.
There was a real British economic story that was then told the world over, and that was an incredible legacy that she has left us.